sister is a redhead. I got green eyes and I grow hair on my chin. I live in the cardinal state of Ohio. We never left the bones of our grandfathers, don't you know? Here in the state they'll never recognize us, because they thought they got rid of us a long time ago. Hey, Ohio. Hey, Ohio. Grazie mia, wish you know. Grazie mia, wish you know. I'm not your Hollywood in the end. I'm not your Hollywood in the end. From the 1920s through the 40s, a man by the name of Walter Plecker was ahead of the state of Virginia's vital statistics. His opinion set policy in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia. He had determined that there were no Native American indigenous peoples left east of the Mississippi, and that those of us who were claiming Indian heritage upon our birth certificates would be denied, because he considered us to be mongrels or no longer Indian. He even did the unthinkable and went into the records and changed the racial classification of my people from Indian to colored. Walter Plecker's paper genocide went unfettered by the federal government. His eugenics movement was used as a model by Hitler's Nazis to annihilate millions of Jews, second only to the Native American Indians' plight of terror and ongoing agenda against us. It was later determined that Plecker had no biological, scientific, or genealogical data to back his claims. Finally, his own arrogance did him in when he was struck by an automobile crossing the street because he thought drivers should stop for him. To this day, my people's racial classification and recognition are still affected by this little man. My great-grandfather was a Cherokee who married a Delaware. His mother was from England. His daddy was a slave to a pioneer. Now we can't live like our ancestors did. They've assimilated us real good. I never signed no treaties, no siree. And now you know I never was.
네, 따로 외도 보이에 스카이 디조. I am known as Bob Walker, also as Eagle, Elk, and Lavelle. And I'm going to take a minute here to talk to you about the 5 lies they teach us in school. Number 5. There were 13 original colonies in America. Original 13 British colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, it's easy to understand why people believe this lie, but it's a lie nonetheless. The American flag has 13 stripes representing the original 13 colonies, but really, there were only 12 colonies. That's because Delaware was never a separate colony. After the British invaded the region and stole it from the Dutch in 1660, the Delaware territory was juggled between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Eventually it ended up the ownership of William Penn, This is the guy who owned Pennsylvania. And it remained a part of Pennsylvania until the Revolutionary War. In fact, it wasn't even called Delaware. It was just known as the three lower counties. Okay, on to more serious things. Number 4. Europeans invaded Africa and kidnapped slaves. Lie number 4. This isn't meant to trivialize slavery or pardon anyone who took part in this or condone it in any way. But let's face it, most Americans are under the impression that colonial era slavery got its start with white people selling over to Africa and kidnapping hundreds of thousands of people and bringing them to Europe and America in chains. Now, parts of that is true. There were lots of chains and many Africans were kidnapped, but despite the picture painted by many historian textbooks and the lies they teach you in school and the Roots miniseries you watch on TV, which was actually a plagiarized book stolen by Alex Haley, written originally by a white guy. The majority of those slaves were actually sold to Europeans by other Africans, by African slave traders. Slave traders who had been operating on the continent for thousands of years, because slavery is nothing new to that part of the world. It was actually pretty normal at that time. In fact, Egyptians were using Caucasian slaves in their armies during the 13th century. Even the Bible endorses the practice. As far as the Atlantic slave trade was concerned, in country, African slaves were typically members of a defeated tribe. But as soon as the slave traders realized that Europeans would pay for their slaves, they actually began kidnapping people just to sell them on the Nigerian coast. So that's number 4. Counting down, lie number 3. Abraham Lincoln was strongly opposed to slavery. Honest Abe. Abraham Lincoln is often put on a pedestal as one of the greatest opponents of slavery for freeing the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. In fact, he struggled with conflicting and ambiguous views on slavery, not to mention sexuality. During his entire presidential career, he wasn't a stalwart supporter of abolition. He only wanted to do what would make the Union stronger, what would bring his people together. Remember, this was a time when the Confederate States and the split from the Union were at war. In his own words, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. How come they don't teach that in school? And if they mention it, they whisper it. But let me keep on. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that too. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. Counting down, number 3. The founding fathers were all Christians. Okay, so one of the prevailing myths taught in history classes across the country is that the founding fathers of America were all Christians. The Declaration of Independence talks about God, the Pledge of Allegiance, which incidentally wasn't even created until more than a century later, uses the words under God, and it all sort of jumbles together into the idea that Washington and his crew were Bible-thumping Christian men. Well, they weren't. For starters, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were both believed to be deists who don't follow the Bible explicitly but assume there's a God. because nature is so great. George Washington most likely followed pantheism, which is the belief that nature is God, and John Adams was a Unitarian, an offshoot of Christianity that believes Jesus was a great guy, but not God's son. And Alexander Hamilton was a typical Christian, but only later in life after his son was killed. Counting down to our last one, Thanksgiving. This is the mega lie they teach in school. Here's the lie. Pilgrims on the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620, unprepared for the harsh winter. They were saved by the friendly natives who gave them food and taught them how to plant corn. The following autumn, on the first harvest in the New World, they had a feast to commemorate the hardships they had survived, and the Pilgrim and Indian joined hands in celebration. That's a lie. The real story is a touch more cruel, murderous, and genocidal. 3 years before the Pilgrims arrived, European fishermen and settlers had introduced a plague that had swept through the tribes of coastal New England and wiped out nearly 96% of the entire population. There were reportedly so many bodies that settlers would leave the towns rather than deal with them, only to introduce the bug to the next tribe they encountered. One report from a man named Howard Simpson stated villages lay in ruins because there was no one to tend them. The ground was strewn with the skulls and the bones of thousands of Indians who had died, and none was left to bury them. There's also evidence that the Pilgrims already knew about the plague, and so chose Cape Cod because they knew that the Indians had already been wiped out, leaving cleared lands and cornfields ripe for the taking. Even worse, the Pilgrims would steal food and tools from any Indians left alive who were too weak to fight back. But the settlers in Virginia were actually eating the Indians. So I guess the Pilgrims weren't that bad by comparison. Yes, I did say eating them.
And I'm thankful for my kindergarten class who made these wonderful crafts to celebrate Thanksgiving.
After the Native Americans helped the Pilgrims survive their first winter in America, the Puritans invited them to share the first Thanksgiving.
Oh, these are adorably strong.
A 5-year-old made that.
Based off of the lies that you taught them.
Excuse me?
Oh, it's not your fault. These are full of half-truths and historical propaganda.
I thought the Native Americans and the Pilgrims were like besties or whatever.
At best, the Pilgrims and Wampanoags could be described as political allies. By the time the Pilgrims showed up, not only were 2/3 of the Massachusetts tribes completely wiped out by European slave owners and diseases, the Pilgrims were constantly at war with the indigenous people and routinely tortured them.
But what about Squanto, the Native American who learned English to help out the Pilgrims?
He was actually a slave that was hauled off to Europe, and then he learned English so that he could escape.
But they did celebrate it every year, right?
Not exactly. The next one was 16 years later, and unfortunately, it was because the Puritans were celebrating the massacre of the Pequot tribe. Back then, Thanksgiving was also for families, specifically murdering them.
Okay, we get it. History's awful. The Puritans were terrible. And now we have to let our children know that the holiday started with tons of killings. Happy?
Well, we actually have just about everything wrong with the Thanksgiving myth. Definitely didn't wear these buckle hats. Didn't land on Plymouth Rock. And as for that turkey...
Oh, no, not turkey.
More like venison, fowl, and eel.
Oh! Who cares about how this stupid holiday got started anyway?
Exactly. In George Washington's 1789 Thanksgiving Proclamation, the settlers aren't mentioned not even once. Thanksgiving wasn't celebrated nationwide until 1863 when this guy declared it a national holiday during the Civil War in order to bring the country together. That's why all of our foods are from the 19th century.
So Lincoln came up with the whole Indian pilgrim story.
Nope, that myth didn't catch on until the 1900s after we had fought and killed all the Native Americans. And then we put it into textbooks as fact. Because America. But the food is really good, and if you ignore all the terrible history, like, the murdering, the raping, the pillaging, it's still kind of a great holiday.
So the Mayflower is a lie.
Why do we eat cranberry sauce?
What about stuffing?
Is Black Friday really just a capitalist conspiracy to get poor people to buy things so we can't truly live out a populist revolt?
Or is it?
Really in America? Is this really in America?
And what about corn?
I am never telling you the truth ever again.
I have to give you the bonus lie. I did say that Thanksgiving was the mega lie. This is the bonus lie, the biggest lie that started everything. Teachers tell us about Columbus. See, since the founding of the United States, every school-age child was taught that Christopher Columbus originally named the inhabitants of the land he discovered Indians, because he mistakenly thought he found a route to the Indies. What a lie. See, the self-proclaimed inheritor of the right of discovery, the United States government and its European imperial ancestors successfully usurped the entire Western Hemisphere from the original indigenous people and redefined their identity, ways of life, community standards, family structure, language, tribal confederations, concepts of sovereignty and freedom, clan and blood laws, and spiritual practices. Complete genocide.
You and me and everything that breathes is connected to the sacred seal, world sacred seed, DNA, the memory of all time. Mother's twin sons recorded code creates all the circles of life.
To ensure their destruction, the powers of the empire devised what I freely term a fire and forget strategy, a self-perpetuating and artificial construct termed the American Indian, and the American Indian world, an artificial person and world that is maintained by the very subjects that it has subjugated and redefined. The origin of the term is purportedly due to the circumstances of a 1400s sailor called Christopher Columbus, allegedly discovering a shorter oceanic route to what we are told were the lands referred to in his day as the Indies. Was India even known by its original peoples as India or the Indies? Was it known as India prior to 1492? No, India was not the true name as used by the people of that continent, of that place, of that region. The etymology of the term India from Latin means region of the Indus River. Beyond the reality that the indigenous peoples of India did not refer to their domains as such, even at that time of the infamous Columbus, the name India was not in use until the 16th century. The name Hindustan combines Sindhu and Hindu, and thus freely infers the land of the Hindus. At the time of Columbus, India was known by the Persian epithet variously Hindus and Hindustan. No county, land, sea, or people in the world were named India prior to 1492. One of the priests who accompanied Columbus, his name is Bartholomew de las Casas. He described the natives of the Caribbean as being one with nature, generous, open-hearted, willing to give, and almost childlike. He described them as being children of God. In Latin language of ecclesiastics and royalty of the time, the people or children of God, as Spaniards often refer to the indigenous, translates freely as Los Niños de la Indio, and consequently Los Niños de la Indios, more literally children of God, Indio, freely of God. The proceeding from narratives of Bartholomew de las Casas, together with additional reports concerning his pleas to the King and Queen of Spain in behalf of the few surviving indigenous people of the Caribbean, is likely as close as one is to come to comprehending the origin of the term Indio and Indian as applied to American Indians. The inhabitants were called Los Niños de la Indio, children of God, by Columbus. So in school, when they teach Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and discovered America, the first lie with this is he never made it to America. He never made it past the Caribbean islands. His crew sailed across the rest of the Atlantic about 500 miles over to the coast of America. Columbus never made it over there. And the natives he encountered was called Los Niños de la Indio because they were considered to be children of God, not because he thought he was in India and called the people Indians, because the place called India wasn't even called India during the time Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It was called Hindustan, or Bharat, not India. India is a lie. Calling us Indians because he thought he was in India is a lie. So that's your bonus. It's important that we educate our children at home and not leave them to be taught and miseducated by the school, the public schools, because all around the world, all places that are colonized, the history is rewritten in the history of those who colonized the land. If an invader invades and colonizes, the history will be rewritten, because to be an invader is also equivalent to being a terrorist. And you can't be a hero and a terrorist at the same time. So you have to rewrite the history and write yourselves in as being heroes. And the founding fathers, who everybody so lovingly quotes, are looked at as heroes and not as terrorists. But when you examine everything that Andrew Jackson did, Walter Plecker, and all of the other military generals, colonels, all of the military officers from the East Coast to the wars of the Cheyenne, Apache, and the Sioux Nation, and look at all of the slaughter, all of the hangings, all of the burnings, just everything that has been done. History had to be rewritten to make them into heroes, because everything they did was the complete opposite. And if it was told the way it really happened, are you so programmed that you wouldn't be able to see it?